In every workplace, productivity rises and falls not only on systems and strategy, but on something far more unpredictable: people. Some motivate, others inspire, but a few drain energy like a slow leak in a tire. These are the difficult personalities, the chronic complainers, the passive-aggressive resistors, and the employees whose attitude becomes a silent virus in the team. Harry E. Chambers' The Bad Attitude Survival Guide is not a manual about punishment or control. It is a deep dive into the psychology of behavior at work, why people resist, why some sabotage, why others simply stop caring, and most importantly, what managers can do to understand, navigate, and transform these challenging patterns. Chambers approaches difficult attitudes not as flaws to be eliminated, but as signals. Every bad attitude has roots: frustration, confusion, miscommunication, poor leadership, or personal battles. The real skill lies in decoding these signals and responding with clarity, strength, and emotional intelligence. In this summary, we explore the core tools Chambers offers for surviving and even improving the most challenging workplace attitudes. It's a journey through human behavior, managerial mindset, and the intricate dance between authority and empathy. Before we dive in, remember to like this video and subscribe to Read and Rise so you never miss another powerful and practical book summary. Chapter 1. Understanding the Roots of Bad Attitude. The opening chapter sets the stage for everything Harry E. Chambers wants us to understand. A bad attitude is never random. It doesn't erupt from a vacuum, nor does it appear simply because someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Chambers argues that behind every difficult behavior lies a story, a combination of unmet expectations, misaligned communication, personal pressures, or organizational flaws that quietly shape how people act. He begins by dismantling the most common managerial myth: a bad attitude is the employee's problem alone. Chambers insists this view is both shallow and dangerous. Organizations are living ecosystems. When something goes wrong inside, it reverberates outward. Employees who are confused, undervalued, or poorly led often express their frustration not through words, but through behavior. The sighing in meetings, the subtle resistance to instructions, the eye-rolling, the sarcasm, the slow pace, or the sudden dip in motivation. These behaviors become the symptoms, but they are not the disease. The chapter paints a vivid picture of how managers often respond, with irritation, discipline, or forced positivity. Yet Chambers invites us to take a different approach, one grounded in curiosity. He encourages managers to observe, decode, and interpret behavior as clues. A bad attitude is often a defensive shield, protecting someone who feels threatened or unheard. Other times, it is an unconscious reaction to feeling overwhelmed or underappreciated. And in many cases, it is a direct reflection of poor management practices, unclear goals, inconsistent direction, favoritism, or a culture that suffocates autonomy. What makes this chapter compelling is the way Chambers merges psychology with realism. He understands that managers are not therapists and employees are not puzzles to be solved endlessly. But he argues that leadership begins with understanding human patterns, and these patterns are rarely simple. By the end of the chapter, he leaves us with one central truth: you cannot fix what you do not understand. And a manager who misreads a bad attitude will always choose the wrong solution. This first step, recognizing the roots rather than reacting to the surface, becomes the foundation for everything that follows. It's a shift in mindset, a reorientation of perspective, and a call to lead with both clarity and empathy. The chapter ends with a quiet challenge. Look at your team, not as a set of behaviors, but as a collection of experiences shaping those behaviors. Only then can change begin. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Negative Attitude. A negative attitude rarely walks into the workplace wearing a neon sign. It is quieter than that, more cryptic, more like a slow leak in a system that once ran smoothly. In Chapter 2, Chambers takes us beneath the surface, inviting managers to study attitude the way a biologist studies cells, patiently, curiously, and without flinching. Chambers begins by clarifying that an employee's attitude is not a single emotion, but a pattern of behaviors, repeated often enough that they begin shaping the emotional climate around them. A bad attitude is essentially a habit, reinforced by past rewards, past frustrations, or past attempts to protect one's sense of control. This chapter dissects attitude into its elemental components. There is the emotion, the internal storm no one sees directly. There is the behavior, the visible ripple that reveals the storm's existence. And then there is the impact, the often unintended fallout that affects teams, deadlines, and morale. Managers often jump straight to the behavior, rolling eyes, missed deadlines, sarcasm, resistance. But Chambers argues that focusing only on behavior is like treating symptoms without diagnosing the disease. To understand attitude, you must understand what fuels it: fear, boredom, insecurity, lack of recognition, resentment, confusion about expectations, or simply a mismatch between personal values and job demands. He highlights a subtle truth. People rarely choose negativity, they drift into it. They drift because no one clarified the standards. They drift because feedback came too late. They drift because the environment rewards silence instead of honesty. One of the chapter's most striking ideas is the notion that attitude is contagious. A single chronically negative employee can influence productivity far beyond their job description. This makes the manager not just an observer, but a guardian of team energy. Every unaddressed attitude becomes a precedent. Every tolerated behavior becomes a template. Cultures are built this way, quietly, invisibly, one reaction at a time. Chambers closes the chapter by insisting that managers must treat attitude problems not as battles, but as diagnostic puzzles. The goal is not to punish, but to understand the mechanism behind the behavior. The deeper the understanding, the more precise and humane the intervention. This chapter builds a foundation. Before you can correct a negative pattern, you must learn to recognize its anatomy, trace its causes, and respect its complexity. Only then can you work with people instead of against them. Chapter 3. The Roots of Negative Workplace Behavior. This chapter dives into the uncomfortable but necessary question: why do some employees act as if work is a punishment instead of a profession? Chambers explains that negative behavior rarely appears suddenly. It grows slowly, like a thin crack spreading across glass, fed by small frustrations that go unnoticed or unresolved. He emphasizes that poor attitudes usually emerge from systemic conditions: unfairness, unclear expectations, inconsistent leadership, or a chronic lack of recognition. Negative behavior, in this view, is not a personality flaw, but a signal flare from someone who feels unseen, unheard, or undervalued. Chambers also highlights that employees often carry workplace baggage from past jobs, old wounds, distrust, or habits shaped by previous leaders. These experiences cling to them like residue, influencing their reactions in the present. Understanding this makes a manager's role less about discipline and more about decoding the source of resistance. The key idea in this chapter is that leaders should focus on repairing the environment that breeds negative attitudes, not just the attitude itself. This shift in perspective sets the groundwork for the strategies and tools introduced in the following chapters. Chapter 4: When Attitude Turns Toxic. Some attitudes are merely inconvenient. Mild pessimism, quiet resistance, a tendency to complain after a long day. Chapter 4, however, escorts us into darker terrain, the realm of truly toxic behavior, where negativity stops being a personal quirk and becomes a corrosive force that reshapes the entire workplace. Chambers treats toxicity not as a dramatic label, but as a measurable disruption. A toxic employee is someone whose behavior consistently drains energy rather than generating it. Someone whose presence introduces tension the way humidity introduces heat, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. Their negativity becomes a gravitational field that pulls team morale downward. He introduces several patterns that signal toxicity. One is chronic criticism, not thoughtful feedback, but habitual undermining. These employees poke holes in every idea, challenge every decision, and seem to gain satisfaction from proving that things won't work. Another pattern is passive sabotage, work that is intentionally slowed, precision that mysteriously disappears, deadlines that always slip because something came up. Then there is chronic victimhood, the employee who positions themselves as perpetually wronged, insisting the world is unfair and the job is a battlefield they never volunteered for. None of these behaviors emerge overnight. Toxicity usually grows over time, watered by neglect, conflict avoidance, or poor communication. Managers often hope it will fade on its own. It rarely does. Instead, it becomes a kind of informal leadership. Other employees recalibrate their behavior around the toxic individual, learning what to avoid, what not to say, and which tasks to keep away from them. This is leadership in negative form, subtle but powerful. Chambers emphasizes that managers must resist the temptation to ignore toxicity simply because the toxic individual is highly skilled or hard to replace. Skills can be taught, attitude cannot. Every day a toxic employee remains unchallenged is a day that the team's emotional economy suffers. People become more guarded, less willing to experiment, less willing to collaborate. Creativity shrinks, trust erodes, productivity bends under the weight of emotional tension. The chapter also challenges managers to look inward. Toxicity, he argues, is not just a trait, it is a feedback loop. If a manager reacts with frustration, sarcasm, or avoidance, they feed the very energy they wish to eliminate. Effective intervention requires calm, clarity, and an almost scientific neutrality. The goal isn't to win an argument, but to disrupt a pattern. Chambers tells managers to document behavior, not emotions. Quantify the missed deadlines, the disrupted meetings, the unresolved conflicts. When the time comes to address the issue, clarity protects both sides. Vague accusations provoke defensiveness. Specific examples open the door to accountability. In the final stretch of the chapter, he returns to a central truth. Not all toxicity is intentional. Sometimes it emerges from stress, burnout, or misalignment between a person's role and their strengths. Addressing toxicity doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means support, guidance, or realignment. Chapter 4 stands as a reminder that attitude is not merely about good or bad behavior. It is about the health of the system. A workplace is an ecosystem, and one poisoned root eventually harms the entire tree. The manager's job is not only to correct, but to cultivate.
to safeguard the environment in which people must spend so much of their lives.
Chapter 5. Confrontation without combat. Confrontation is one of those words that makes most managers wince. It conjures images of raised voices, defensive postures, and conversations that leave both sides bruised. Yet, Chambers insists that healthy confrontation is not combat. It is maintenance, the emotional equivalent of tightening bolts before the entire machine shakes itself apart. The chapter opens with a simple truth. Unresolved behavior doesn't stay flat. It escalates. Left alone, a minor attitude issue matures into a major disruption. The manager who avoids confrontation is not preserving harmony. They are postponing chaos. Chambers reframes confrontation as a structured dialogue where clarity is the main ingredient. He suggests thinking of it the way a doctor thinks of diagnostic conversations: specific symptoms, observable patterns, documented evidence. The goal is to identify behavior, not attack personality. People may resist criticism, but they cannot easily deny what is measurable. He walks through the anatomy of a productive confrontation. It begins before the conversation itself, with preparation. Managers should define not only the behavior, but also the impact, how this behavior affects the team, the workflow, or the final product. This transforms the discussion from personal reproach to professional reality. Then comes choosing a time and place that encourages privacy and calm. Public confrontations turn employees into performers. Private ones turn them into participants. Once the conversation starts, tone becomes everything. Chambers encourages managers to adopt what you might call gentle firmness, a voice that carries authority without aggression. The conversation opens with observations. In the last 3 team meetings, you interrupted colleagues 5 times and dismissed their input. Facts anchor the discussion. From there, the manager transitions to expectations. This team needs cooperative dialogue. Your contributions are valued, but the way you deliver them is disrupting collaboration. Chambers stresses that the employee must be given space to respond, not to derail the conversation, but to reveal context. Sometimes negativity comes from personal strain, unclear expectations, or hidden frustrations within the organization. Listening isn't a concession, it's a diagnostic tool. A manager who listens learns what levers can shift behavior. However, confrontation also requires boundaries. Managers should avoid falling into argumentative spirals. Complaints, distractions, or accusations should be acknowledged briefly, then redirected to the main point. Like a compass returning to north, the conversation must always circle back to behavior and impact. Consequences, Chambers warns, should never be threats, but they must be real. When boundaries have been clearly communicated and support has been offered, the employee must understand what continued negativity will cost, not as punishment, but as cause and effect within a professional environment. The chapter ends by highlighting an unexpected reward of healthy confrontation: respect. Many employees, even the difficult ones, respect managers who address issues directly and fairly. Indirectness breeds suspicion. Clarity builds trust. When managers develop the courage to confront without aggression, to guide without shaming, the team begins to operate with greater confidence. People know where the lines are, and more importantly, they know the person drawing them is consistent. Chapter 6. Turning Attitude Around: Tools for Behavioral Change. Chambers opens this chapter with a sober reminder. Managers cannot fix people, but they can influence conditions that encourage better behavior. Attitude, he argues, is partly internal chemistry and partly environmental feedback. When one of these elements shifts, behavior tends to follow. The task of a manager is to create an environment where positive conduct becomes the natural, advantageous choice. He starts by examining the emotional physics inside a workplace. People rarely wake up wanting to be difficult. Negative behavior usually blooms from three roots: misunderstanding, frustration, or misalignment. Misunderstanding leads to confusion, frustration leads to resentment, and misalignment leads to disengagement. When a manager identifies which root is feeding the negativity, they can choose the right tool to address it. One of the most powerful tools is expectation clarity. Ambiguous expectations are fertile soil for bad attitudes. When employees don't understand what success looks like, they create their own version and defend it fiercely. Chambers encourages managers to craft expectations that are concrete, observable, and mutually understood. This transforms workplace stress into structured challenge, which is far easier to navigate. Next comes feedback, the twin sibling of expectations. Chambers makes a distinction between reactive feedback and proactive feedback. Reactive feedback is the classic "we need to talk" conversation. It's necessary but stressful. Proactive feedback, however, is woven into daily interactions. It acknowledges good behavior quickly, redirects poor behavior early, and eliminates the element of surprise. When used consistently, proactive feedback becomes a stabilizing rhythm that keeps attitudes from drifting into dangerous territory. Another tool is workplace involvement, not superficial involvement, but meaningful responsibility. People with nothing at stake tend to stew in negativity. People with ownership tend to rise to the challenge. Chambers suggests assigning tasks that combine accountability with autonomy, allowing employees to experience the dignity of contribution. It's not about dumping work on them. It's about inviting them to shape the team's results. Chambers also explores the subtle power of managerial modeling. A leader's attitude is contagious. Teams mirror the emotional tone of the person guiding them. A manager who displays patience, composure, and consistency becomes a psychological anchor. Conversely, a manager who reacts emotionally teaches the team that emotional reactivity is acceptable. Leadership, in this view, is less about verbal instruction and more about behavioral demonstration. A particularly interesting part of the chapter deals with the emotional thermostat, the invisible emotional climate that managers set, intentionally or not. Managers must stay aware of how their moods and reactions shape the office ecosystem. Calm managers cool overheated situations. Impulsive managers ignite them. Emotional control is less about suppressing feeling and more about pacing it wisely. He also introduces the concept of behavioral contracts, informal but structured agreements where both manager and employee define desired behavior, support mechanisms, and checkpoints. These contracts aren't punishments, they're partnerships. They offer employees a map back to stronger performance, and managers give a framework for measuring improvement. Finally, Chambers reminds readers that change must be reinforced. A shift in attitude is fragile at first, like a seedling that needs sunlight, not a spotlight. Managers must acknowledge progress, encourage consistency, and avoid the temptation to dissect every small misstep. Behavioral change becomes permanent only when the employee sees that improvement leads to tangible, ongoing benefits. The chapter closes with a pragmatic insight. Managers don't need to win battles. They need to build momentum. Small improvements sustained over time reshape the overall culture. Even the most difficult employee can surprise you when the environment invites their best self forward. And just as importantly, the team begins to see the manager not as an enforcer, but as a steward of stability. This smooth transition prepares the ground for the next chapter, where Chambers explores the structural elements of workplace culture and how managers can build environments where negative behavior not only struggles to survive, but eventually feels out of place. Chapter 7: Building a Culture that Rejects Negativity. Chambers begins this chapter with a crisp observation. Individual attitude problems may flare up unpredictably, but a toxic workplace culture never appears by accident. It is formed slowly, through neglect, inconsistency, or unclear values. By the same logic, a healthy culture must be created deliberately, brick by brick, decision by decision, conversation by conversation. A manager who wants fewer attitude problems must cultivate an environment in which negativity simply feels unwelcome. He describes workplace culture as a living organism, shaped by shared habits, unofficial rules, and daily interactions. It is not defined by posters on walls or mission statements framed in hallway glass. It is defined by how people behave when they are under pressure, when no one is watching, or when a conflict emerges. Culture, for Chambers, is what people actually do, not what they are told to do. The first tool he highlights is consistency. Inconsistent leadership breeds suspicion. When employees don't know which version of the manager they will meet, the calm one or the irritable one, they retreat into defensive behavior. But when the manager's reactions are predictable and grounded, employees relax into cooperation. Consistency is the psychological soil in which trust grows. Next comes shared expectations. Team members must understand not only what is expected from them individually, but what is expected from the group. Chambers insists on creating a communal understanding of values such as responsibility, collaboration, and respect. When these expectations become social norms, employees begin to regulate each other's attitudes. Peer pressure becomes a positive force that keeps negativity contained. He also emphasizes celebrating productive behavior. Recognition, when used authentically, elevates a culture's emotional tone. It signals that good attitudes matter just as much as good results. Chambers warns against hollow praise. Employees detect insincerity instantly. Instead, managers should highlight specific behaviors that reinforce the team's standards. Moments of initiative, acts of support, calm responses under stress. These acknowledgments act like emotional currency. They circulate throughout the team and encourage others to participate. Another cultural pillar is transparent communication. Rumors and ambiguity are fuel for cynicism. Chambers urges managers to communicate openly, even when the information is incomplete. People often tolerate bad news far better than secrecy. When employees understand the why behind decisions, the emotional static between leadership and staff decreases. Transparency clears the air, literally and figuratively. The chapter then moves into the power of collaborative problem-solving. When a team participates in shaping solutions, they feel ownership, and ownership sharpens attitude. People protect what they help build. Managers who invite contributions, ask for insights, and incorporate suggestions cultivate loyalty and reduce resistance. Chambers doesn't ignore the hard truth that some individuals persistently resist cultural norms. In these cases, the culture itself becomes the corrective force. A healthy team subtly isolates unproductive negativity, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of misalignment. When a workplace consistently reinforces good behavior, those who choose the opposite begin to feel out of sync. Many eventually improve simply to reintegrate. One of the chapter's most compelling sections explores rituals and routines as cultural anchors. Daily check-ins, weekly roundups, open door hours. These simple, predictable structures create rhythm and reduce emotional volatility. They give employees a sense of stability, and stability tempers negative behavior. Rituals are the heartbeat of culture.
Chambers rounds off the chapter by reminding managers that culture is not built through dramatic events. It is built through accumulation. Every small act of fairness, every clear expectation, every respectful conversation contributes to the cultural atmosphere. A strong culture doesn't just reduce negativity. It attracts people who thrive on clarity, cooperation, and mutual respect. As the chapter closes, Chambers sets the stage for what comes next: the personal evolution of the manager. Before guiding others, the manager must refine their own resilience, emotional intelligence, and leadership presence. The next chapter shifts from environmental design to the internal toolkit a manager must cultivate to survive and excel when faced with even the toughest attitudes.
Chapter 8. Sustaining a healthy team after change. In this chapter, the focus shifts from addressing individual negative behaviors to maintaining long-term team health after implementing changes. Chambers emphasizes that even when managers successfully neutralize bad attitudes, the work is not done. Sustaining a positive, productive environment requires ongoing attention, clear communication, and reinforcement of organizational culture. Change, whether it's a new process, structure, or leadership approach, inevitably creates uncertainty and stress. Even employees who previously exhibited a cooperative attitude may struggle to adapt. Negative behaviors can resurface if the team feels unsupported or if old patterns reemerge. Chambers advises managers to anticipate these challenges and embed supportive mechanisms into daily operations. A key strategy is consistent recognition of positive behaviors. Managers are encouraged to celebrate small wins, highlight collaborative efforts, and reinforce desired attitudes. This creates a feedback loop that encourages employees to maintain constructive behavior and reduces the likelihood of backsliding into negativity. Equally important is the need for ongoing monitoring. Keeping an eye on team dynamics, conducting regular check-ins, and providing timely feedback ensures that minor issues are addressed before they escalate. Chambers also stresses the importance of transparent communication. Sharing updates, explaining decisions, and soliciting input helps employees feel valued and included. When individuals understand the rationale behind changes and see their role in the team's success, they are less likely to develop resentment or disengage. Open dialogue fosters trust, strengthens cohesion, and encourages accountability. Another critical element is building resilience within the team. Chambers suggests providing resources for stress management, promoting flexibility, and encouraging problem-solving skills. A resilient team can weather setbacks, adapt to evolving challenges, and maintain a positive environment even under pressure. The chapter illustrates that proactive leadership, empathy, and structured support are the cornerstones of sustained team health. Finally, the chapter highlights the long-term payoff of maintaining a healthy team culture. Teams that consistently reinforce positive attitudes and behaviors are more innovative, collaborative, and productive. Employees are more engaged, turnover decreases, and organizational goals are achieved more efficiently. Chambers leaves readers with a clear message. Managing bad attitudes is not a one-time task. It is an ongoing commitment to shaping and nurturing a culture of respect, accountability, and growth. Conclusion: Mastering the Art of Positive Leadership. Harry E. Chambers closes the Bad Attitude Survival Guide by reinforcing a central truth. Managing attitudes is one of the most crucial responsibilities of any manager. It is not enough to simply address negative behavior when it arises. Effective leaders proactively cultivate an environment that encourages collaboration, accountability, and positivity. Chambers emphasizes that attitude is contagious, both positively and negatively. A single bad attitude can spread quickly and disrupt productivity, while consistent recognition of positive behavior can elevate an entire team's performance. The book underscores practical strategies, from early identification of negative behaviors to constructive feedback, coaching, and accountability systems. Chambers reminds readers that tough decisions, including disciplinary measures or terminations, may be necessary at times, but they should always be paired with empathy, clarity, and structured support. Ultimately, a manager's role is to balance discipline with guidance, ensuring that each team member understands expectations and feels empowered to improve. In the final analysis, the guide teaches that building and sustaining a healthy team culture is a continuous journey. Attention to attitudes, open communication, emotional intelligence, and leadership consistency are the pillars of long-term success. By applying these principles, managers can transform potentially disruptive environments into thriving, productive, and engaged workplaces. If you found these insights helpful, hit the like button, subscribe to Read and Rise, and turn on notifications so you never miss more practical strategies to master leadership, improve team dynamics, and unlock the full potential of your workplace.